This video is sponsored by the Professional Photographers of America, PPA. Join a community of over 31,000 photographers that includes equipment, insurance, business tools, and education specifically for small business owners like you. I'm testing the latest and greatest mirrorless 70-200s from Canon, Fuji, Sony, and Nikon because smart camera buyers don't just buy a camera body based on megapixels and sensor size. They find the best lens, and then they choose the body that drives that lens. I wish I could test only the lenses for you. There's no way to do that, so I've attached the state-of-the-art camera to each of these lenses. The Canon R5, because the Canon R3 doesn't exist yet. The Fujifilm X-T4, the Sony Alpha 1, and the Nikon Z7 II. Again, the Z9 doesn't exist yet, but subscribe and we'll test it as soon as it's available. We're going to look at the results of these combinations and find out which company has the best 70-200. Let's start with the size, weight, and price. Now I have them in order from smallest to largest. This makes a big difference when you have to pack a bag and fit it in the overhead carrier. Smaller is always better. And the Canon really wins big here with its collapsible design. It zooms out and telescopes when you actually go to use it, but put it away in your bag and it's really small. Unfortunately, it's the second heaviest despite being the smallest. The Fuji 50-140 f2.8 is the closest equivalent they have to these full-frame 70-200 f2.8s. In full-frame terms, it would produce images that look just like a 70-200 f4 lens. It's equivalent to f4 because it gathers less than half the total light for its smaller sensor. We have a whole video on crop factor if you're confused about why that is. Because it has a smaller sensor and it's gathering less light, that makes it the lightest lens here. But still, it's not as compact as the amazing Canon lens. Moving on to the third longest lens here, the Sony isn't a collapsing design, but it's actually lighter than the Canon, just a little bit heavier than the Fuji because they managed to make it really lightweight. Notice that when it zooms, it does not telescope. A lot of people see this as an advantage because telescoping lenses can pull in a lot of dust. And while that doesn't hurt you in year 1 or maybe even year 2, by year 4 or 5 of ownership, every telescoping lens I've ever owned and used a lot has a bunch of dust inside of it. It has to pull air in and out, therefore you can never completely keep out all the dust. The biggest and heaviest lens here is the Nikon. This thing is a beast. It's just noticeably heavier than the Sony, and I wouldn't want to carry it around in my bag. Sometimes though, bigger gear is worth it. So let's do some image quality comparisons. First, let's check the difference between the most expensive setup, the Sony, and the least expensive, the Fuji. Here, the sharpness differences are drastic, even in the center of the image. In the corner of the image, even at a moderate focal length, you can see the more expensive setup shows drastically more detail. Compare the Sony to the Nikon, however, and the differences completely disappear. The Sony and the Nikon showed indistinguishable, near perfect image quality, which is an accomplishment for the Nikon since it's significantly less expensive. The same is true for the Canon lens, essentially indistinguishable from the Nikon and Sony. In fact, in the center, it might be just a tiny bit sharper. In the corners, perhaps a little worse with some chromatic aberration, but it feels tied to the Sony and Nikon. Now let's test the contrast of the lens by simulating shooting into the sun in a controlled environment. This is important in any backlit situation. Lenses bounce light around and can get washed out. And as you can see, the most expensive Sony kit on the left shows a great deal of contrast and detail in the eye despite the backlit conditions. The Fuji gets completely washed out. Compare the Sony on the left to the Canon and you can see the Canon is far more washed out. This light really blinds the camera. Zooming into the eye, we see significantly more detail from the Sony lens. The Canon lens simply does not have great contrast. The Sony lens also shows more contrast than the Nikon lens. Like look at the hair here and how it's completely blown out in the bloom of the backlight. And zooming into the eye, the Sony lens shows far more detail. Comparing the Nikon to the Canon looks a little bit better to me. This is all really expensive gear, and so it's really important that you protect it. I'm a member of PPA, the Professional Photographers of America, and they provide over $15,000 of insurance in case your gear does get stolen. That's full replacement coverage with a flat $350 deductible, or you can repair your equipment with a flat $50 deductible. PPA is the largest non-profit photography organization in the world. It's worth it alone for the insurance, but PPA also gives new members free admission to Imaging USA 2022, the oldest and largest photography conference. This year, Imaging USA has more than 80 speakers, exhibits, new products, the chance to network with other photographers. Use this link to get a discount on your PPA membership and get free admission to Imaging USA. Thanks for sponsoring us, PPA. Let's now compare bokeh. The Nikon on the left has significantly bigger bokeh balls than the Fuji lens does. Though they're both f2.8 lenses, the Fuji has an APS-C sensor with a 1.5 times crop factor. That means it produces images more similar to an f4 lens, and thus the smaller physical aperture produces less striking bokeh. We can see the Fuji also has poor quality of bokeh with hard edges to the bokeh. The shape of the Fuji bokeh is less symmetrical as well. The Nikon's bokeh is also better than the Canon's bokeh, which is blurry and kind of chaotic. The winner again is the Sony lens, which has completely clean bokeh with no texture, no hard edges that you see a little bit on the Nikon lens. These are details most clients won't notice, but we're really nitpicky here. If we go back and compare the first place image to the fourth place image, we can see some differences right away. This image has darker hair, better contrast. The Fuji image has this weird rainbow that popped up. Without even zooming in, we can see the Fuji bokeh is sort of oddly shaped and small, but if we do zoom in, we can see pretty drastic hard edges here that could be distracting to people. These aren't things a civilian would notice, but serious photographers can tell the difference. Now let's test focus breathing, or what I call focal shrinking. This is how much the focal length shrinks as you get really close to a subject. This is why I originally switched from Nikon back to Canon, because the Nikon 70-200 at headshot range was only 135 millimeters. Yeah, it can be a really big deal. It can screw up, especially weddings where you need to move quickly and you might not be able to get close to your subject. So let's see how big my little guy is when I stand in the same place with all these cameras. Always zoomed in at the longest end. And you can see the Fuji is the winner, getting closest to the subject. 140 millimeters with the 1.5 times crop does translate to 210 millimeters, but that doesn't explain this huge difference between second place, held by both the Sony and the Nikon. In last place, the Canon is significantly further away at 200 millimeters because of its significant focal breathing, otherwise known as focus shrinking. And now I'm going to test the maximum magnification, not the minimum focusing distance, because of the focus breathing we just described. How close you can get to a subject doesn't necessarily relate to how big it's actually going to be in the frame. So for each of these cameras, I'm going to put them in manual focus and see how close I can get to my little guy. Here, the loser is the Nikon. You can see my little guy is significantly smaller than any of these other subjects. Third place by just a hair is the Fuji. The winner seems to be the Sony and the Canon, which both have a slightly better maximum magnification, but really these three are all tied and the Nikon loses. And now I'm going to test the starburst effect, where I shoot at f22 directly into the sun. Don't try this with a DSLR or you might blind yourself. There's something I noticed about two of these lenses. They have aperture rings on the lens themselves, and I just love using that. I don't know if it's more practical, but it's more fun. This is the Sony lens. This is the Fuji lens. The Nikon lens has this little window that I can't really read, and the Canon lens has a programmable ring that can control the aperture, but doesn't have the numbers on it. I don't like that as much. There are two ways to judge starbursts, and the first is which just looks the coolest. I think the Canon looks the best, followed by the Fuji. The Nikon and Sony, they actually make most of the starburst disappear. We can also analyze the flaring. In this case, the Sony is the cleanest, followed by the Nikon, the Canon, and finally the Fuji flaring is pretty bad. Let's wrap this up and rank these from worst to best. The Fujifilm XF50-140 is old, and Fuji still does not have a high megapixel flagship camera. Both those things work together to really limit the image quality that it can possibly put out. But for the price, it's still very good. It's still very capable. And frankly, portrait clients will probably never complain about the images that it puts out. A significant step up from that. These three full-frame cameras are actually very close together. But of these three, I have to rank Canon the worst. I love that it's compact, and I've always been so impressed with how it felt and fit into my backpack. But the image quality really was sacrificed, and the fact that it's a push-pull zoom makes me think that this is going to collect dust and be a pain long-term. I wish Canon would release perhaps a higher end 70-200 that didn't compromise image quality for compactness. But still, you know who you are. If this small size and the ability to just chuck it in a backpack will make you more likely to use it, then this is still the right choice. And frankly, the Canon R5 might be the best overall camera in the world. The Canon ecosystem is amazing, and I can't wait to try this out on the Canon R3. In second place, the Nikon 70-200 f2.8 Z lens is absolutely amazing. The image quality is fantastic, definitely better than the Canon, but this lens is a chunk. I hate carrying this thing, and even hand holding it can really wear you out. And the winner here is the brand new Sony 70-200 f2.8 GM Mark II. The previous generation was not that great. In fact, when I first switched to Sony, I continued to use my old Canon DSLR lens with an adapter. I finally just gave that up because the autofocus was problematic, but now I get the best of both worlds. I get amazing image quality. I have an aperture ring that I like. I have zooms that do not pull any dust in, and the flagship A1 is an absolutely amazing camera completing the ecosystem. So congratulations, Sony. And big thank you to Professional Photographers of America for sponsoring this. Click the link in the description to get a discount on your membership, get that insurance for your gear, get free admission to Imaging USA 2022. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Bye.